Iran hit a ship in the Strait of Hormuz. And then, over the following 5 days, the United States hit more than 300 targets in response. That's not an exaggeration for effect. That's the actual number CENTCOM put out, on the record. And it's worth walking through exactly how one attack on one tanker turned into the single most intense week of strikes this entire war had seen up to that point. And I think that's genuinely the part of this story that gets lost in the noise. People remember the dramatic single-night strike footage. They remember the big round numbers. What almost nobody sits down and actually maps out is the sequence: attack, response, bigger attack, bigger response, escalating night after night for 5 straight days until a single missile fired at a tanker on a Monday had turned into the largest coordinated strike campaign of the entire war by that Saturday. That sequence is the actual story, and I don't think you can understand where this war is heading without walking through it step by step. Start with Monday, July 6th, 2026. Iran's military fired at least 2 missiles at commercial ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz, according to 2U. Officials who spoke to reporters that day. The vessels hit were a Marshall Islands flagged tanker called the Rekayyat and a Saudi flagged tanker called the Wedyan. Both vessels took significant damage. No casualties were reported from those 2 strikes specifically. Then, the very next morning, Tuesday, the IRGC hit a 3rd commercial ship, a Liberian-flagged vessel called the Cyprus Prosperity. 2 crude oil tankers and 1 LNG carrier, all struck within about 18 hours of each other, all in the same stretch of water that carries roughly a fifth of the entire world's seaborne oil trade. Here's the detail that actually explains why these particular ships got hit. Iran had already issued its own warnings to international shipping, telling vessels they needed to seek authorization and coordinate over marine radio before transiting the strait, and that ships taking what the U.S. had designated as a safer southern route, hugging the coast of Oman, could be treated as targets if they deviated from Iran's own approved corridor. Most shipping traffic, including vessels from Japan and India, had been complying with Iran's version of the rules. These 3 ships, based on their routing, were not. Think about what that actually means for a merchant captain trying to run a normal shipping route through one of the busiest waterways in the world. There are now, functionally, 2 competing sets of rules for the exact same stretch of water. The American designated route, meant to keep vessels close enough to Oman's coast to stay outside the more contested parts of Iranian territorial waters, and Iran's own approved corridor, which requires vessels to check in over radio and follow a path Tehran controls. A captain choosing which set of rules to follow isn't just making a navigation decision anymore. They're picking a side in an active war, whether they intend to or not. And getting that choice wrong, even by a small margin of course, apparently was enough to get a tanker struck that week. The American response came fast. U.S. Central Command launched retaliatory strikes against Iranian military targets that same Tuesday, hitting more than 80 separate sites. Reuters reported explosions around Sirik, around Bandar Abbas, around Keshem Island, and possibly Karg Island, though CENTCOM specifically declined to confirm Karg as one of the targets that day. What's important here is what the strikes actually focused on. This wasn't a broad strategic strike package aimed at Iran's national oil infrastructure. It was aimed specifically at what analysts call Iran's Maritime strike network, the IRGC attack craft, the coastal radar, the air defense systems, the drone assets, and the anti-ship missile infrastructure that together give Iran the ability to threaten shipping in the strait in the first place. That's a deliberate, narrower target set, and it tells you something about the restraint still being exercised at that point in the week, restraint that was about to run out. Because President Trump, on Wednesday, declared that the ceasefire that had been holding loosely for weeks was over. His own words were blunt. He said he didn't want to deal with them anymore. That's not a diplomatic statement. That's a president publicly closing a door that had been propped open, even if only barely, for weeks of on and off negotiation. By Saturday, July 11th, the situation escalated again, and this time it involved a ship most people watching this war will actually remember by name. The IRGC attacked a Cyprus-flagged container ship called the GFS Galaxy while it was transiting the strait. CENTCOM's own statement described it plainly. Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces blatantly attacked the vessel. 1 crew member went missing. The ship itself was left unable to continue its transit. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre, a monitoring arm of the Royal Navy, separately confirmed that the crew of a damaged container vessel near the strait had been forced to abandon ship altogether. A container ship is a different kind of target than the tanker attacks earlier that week, and I don't think that distinction got enough attention at the time. Tankers carry crude oil or refined fuel, cargo directly tied to the energy story everyone was already watching. A container ship carries ordinary consumer and industrial goods, the kind of cargo that has nothing to do with oil markets at all. Striking one signals something slightly different than striking a tanker does. It tells international shipping companies that no category of vessel gets a pass simply because its cargo isn't energy related. And that's exactly the kind of message that pushes insurers and shipping lines toward blanket caution rather than narrow, commodity-specific caution. Iran's response to its own attack was, in a strange way, almost as significant as the attack itself. The IRGC said it had fired a warning shot at a vessel attempting to use what it called an unauthorized route, and then went further, declaring the entire Strait of Hormuz closed. It framed the incident as a response to what it called outside interference from foreign powers, referring to the pattern of shipping companies attempting to cross through routes Iran hadn't approved. CENTCOM's response to that declaration is worth hearing in its own words, because it's about as direct as military messaging gets. Iran was provided yet another opportunity to demonstrate adherence to the Memorandum of Understanding, after already being held accountable for earlier attacks on commercial vessels, and had again failed to do so. The strikes that followed began at 7:15 p.m. Eastern Time that Saturday, and a U.S. official confirmed they were still ongoing as the statement went out. CENTCOM described this as imposing a heavy cost at the direction of President Trump. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth put it even more bluntly on social media. Iran made a poor choice. Now they pay. Notice the specific phrase, Memorandum of Understanding, sitting inside that CENTCOM statement, because it tells you something the surrounding coverage mostly glossed over. This wasn't the first time Iran had agreed, at least on paper, to some kind of understanding about how commercial shipping would be treated in the Strait. CENTCOM's language, held accountable for earlier attacks, yet another opportunity, again failed, describes a pattern of repeated violations against a standing agreement, not a single isolated incident. That framing matters, because it's the difference between describing this as one rogue attack and describing it as the latest entry in an already established pattern of noncompliance, and CENTCOM clearly wanted the second framing on the record. That Saturday night strike wasn't a symbolic gesture. U.S. forces hit approximately 140 separate Iranian military targets using precision munitions launched from land and sea-based fighter aircraft, drones, and naval vessels. The target list included Iranian missile and drone sites, naval capabilities, ammunition storage facilities, communication networks, and coastal surveillance locations. Add that number to the roughly 80 targets hit earlier in the week, plus whatever fell in between during the second wave of strikes that followed Trump's ceasefire announcement, and CENTCOM confirmed that more than 300 targets had been struck across those 3 separate rounds in a single week. Let's actually sit with that number for a second, because I don't think 300 targets in 5 days fully registers the first time you hear it. That's not one dramatic night of footage. That's a sustained, repeated campaign, night after night, escalating specifically in response to Iran's own escalation against shipping. Every time Iran hit another vessel, the American response got larger, not smaller. 80 targets became 140. A single retaliatory strike became a 3-round campaign inside 1 calendar week. If you're trying to understand the actual shape of American strategy in this war, that escalation curve tells you more than any single strike does on its own. There's a specific kind of signaling happening in that curve that's worth naming directly. If Washington wanted to simply match Iran's aggression, tit for tat, you'd expect roughly proportional response sizes each time. A strike answered by a strike of similar scale. That's not what happened. Each round got measurably bigger than the one before it. 80 targets, then a second wave in between, then 140. That's not proportional retaliation. That's deliberately escalating retaliation, designed specifically to make continued attacks on shipping progressively more costly for Iran with each incident, rather than just as costly as the last one. Whether or not that strategy actually worked as a deterrent is a separate question, but the intent behind that escalating curve is not hard to read once you actually lay the numbers out side by side like this. Then came the part of the story that I think actually got underreported compared to the strikes themselves, and that's the argument over whether the strait was even closed at all. Iran said it was. CENTCOM flatly disagreed. Their statement was direct. Iran does not control the strait. U.S. forces are positioned and prepared to ensure that freedom of navigation remains available despite unwarranted Iranian aggression, harassment, threats, and arbitrary declarations. And then, almost as a mic drop, CENTCOM added 3 words. Traffic is flowing. CENTCOM backed that claim up with numbers, and this is honestly one of the most interesting details buried in all of this reporting. Since early May, they said, U.S. forces had helped facilitate the successful transit of more than 800 commercial vessels and 400 million barrels of crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Think about what that number is actually doing rhetorically. Iran is publicly declaring the strait closed on the same week that the U.S. is publicly citing 800 vessels that made it through anyway. Both of those statements can't be fully true at the same time, and that tension between Iran's declared closure and America's claimed throughput is really the whole information war happening underneath the shooting war. It helps to think about who each of those 2 claims is actually aimed at, because neither government was primarily talking to the other one. Iran's declaration that the strait was closed wasn't really meant to convince Washington of anything. It was meant to project strength domestically, to signal to its own population and to the wider region that Tehran still controls the waterway on its own doorstep. Even in the middle of a war, it's visibly losing ground and elsewhere. CENTCOM's insistence that traffic was flowing, backed by a specific number of vessels and barrels, wasn't really aimed at convincing Iran either. It was aimed at global shipping companies, insurers, and energy markets, the actual audience whose behavior determines whether oil prices spike or hold steady that week. Two governments, two completely different target audiences, two completely incompatible public claims, all coming out of the exact same waterway on the exact same weekend. Iran's own rhetoric after the third round of strikes didn't back down, though. The IRGC said additional attacks would continue until what it called the end of U.S. interference in this region. And Iran's negotiator, a man named Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, added his own warning that Sunday, saying Tehran would not accept what he characterized as one-sided agreements. So even as CENTCOM was insisting traffic was flowing normally, Iran's own political and military leadership was publicly promising this wasn't over. Read those two statements together and you get a clearer sense of who inside Iran's government was speaking to which audience that weekend. The IRGC's line, continued attacks until the end of U.S. interference, is a military threat aimed squarely at deterring further American strikes. Kalibaf's line about refusing one-sided agreements is coming from Iran's actual negotiating track, the diplomatic channel that had, at least loosely, been keeping some kind of ceasefire alive in the weeks before this specific escalation. Having both a military spokesman and a sitting negotiator on record making public statements in the same 24-hour window tells you Iran wasn't speaking with one unified voice that weekend. It was running two tracks in parallel, military escalation and diplomatic positioning, the exact same dual approach that's shown up repeatedly throughout other phases of this war whenever Tehran has needed to look strong militarily while still leaving a door open for negotiation. I want to spend a minute on the patrol boats, because I think this detail explains more about how Iran actually fights this specific fight than almost anything else in the reporting. Social media tracking around this period showed more than 40 IRGC patrol boats operating in the Strait, both patrolling and providing escort to ships traveling along Iran's own designated route. These are small, fast, heavily armed vessels. They're the same category of boat that's been involved in attacks on both U.S. naval vessels and commercial shipping throughout this war. Some estimates put Iran's total patrol boat inventory, before this war even started, at more than 1,000 of these vessels. That's the actual scale of the asymmetric threat sitting underneath every one of these individual ship attacks. Iran was never going to fight this war with a blue water navy capable of challenging an American carrier strike group directly. It was always going to fight with exactly this: dispersed, numerous, cheap, fast attack craft that can escort friendly shipping, harass hostile shipping, and disappear into ordinary maritime traffic when things get dangerous. Picture what 40 of those boats operating simultaneously actually looks like from an American commander's perspective. That's 40 individual, fast-moving armed contacts spread across a narrow waterway, some of them escorting legitimate compliant shipping, some of them potentially preparing to harass or strike vessels that deviate from Iran's approved route, all of them moving through the exact same crowded lanes as regular commercial traffic. Distinguishing hostile intent from routine escort duty in real time from a destroyer's bridge or a fighter pilot's cockpit is an extraordinarily difficult problem, and it's a problem Iran's doctrine is specifically built around exploiting. You don't need every one of those 1,000 boats to be a credible independent threat. You just need enough of them, spread widely enough, that no defender can ever be fully certain which ones actually matter on any given day. That's also why the American strike list makes so much sense once you look at it closely. Missile and drone sites, naval capabilities, ammunition storage, communication networks, coastal surveillance. Every one of those categories exists specifically to support that patrol boat fleet and the broader maritime strike network around it. You're not going to sink 1,000 small boats one at a time with airstrikes. What you can do is take apart the surveillance and coordination infrastructure that lets Iran use that fleet effectively in the first place, the radar picture that tells patrol boats where to go, the communication networks that coordinate their movements, the ammunition depots that keep them supplied. That's the same targeting logic we've seen throughout this entire war. Go after the nervous system instead of chasing every individual limb. There's a reason the strikes stayed focused on that maritime network specifically, rather than expanding into a broader strategic campaign against Iran's national oil infrastructure. And I think that restraint is worth acknowledging, honestly, rather than assuming every strike in this war has been maximalist by default. Hitting Karg Island's actual oil terminal, or striking deep into Iran's interior at national infrastructure, would have been an entirely different scale of escalation. The kind of move that tends to be held in reserve specifically because it's harder to walk back once it happens. And what we saw across those 3 rounds in July was aggressive, sustained, and repeatedly escalating, but it was still bounded around the specific military capability enabling attacks on shipping, not a wholesale assault on the Iranian economy. That distinction matters if you're trying to read where this war might go next, because it tells you there was still a deliberate ceiling being respected. Even in the middle of the most intense week of fighting this conflict had produced up to that point. You can see that same restraint reflected geographically too. The explosions Reuters tracked that week clustered around Sirik, around Bandar Abbas, around Keshem Island, all locations directly tied to the coastal military infrastructure, supporting Iran's maritime operations. CENTCOM's own refusal to confirm Karg Island as a target, even while reporters were actively asking about it, reads as a deliberate signal in its own right. If the strategy had shifted toward economic strangulation that week, Karg would have been the obvious next target, and it wasn't struck. That's not proof restraint will hold indefinitely, but it's evidence that, as of that specific week, the ceiling on this campaign was still being maintained on purpose. Let's talk about what all of this actually did to the wider world, because a story about missiles and patrol boats in a narrow strait doesn't stay contained to that strait. This entire crisis, going back to the war's opening days at the end of February, has already been described as triggering a global fuel crisis, and weeks like this one are exactly why. Every time a tanker gets struck, every time Iran declares the strait closed, every time the exchange of fire escalates from 80 targets to 140, insurance underwriters, shipping companies, and energy traders all over the world are recalculating risk in real time. You don't need the strait to actually be blocked for the price of oil to move. You just need enough uncertainty that shippers start rerouting, insurers start raising premiums, and buyers start bidding up whatever supply looks safest to secure. That's the mechanism connecting a missile strike on the Wedyan or the Cyprus Prosperity to a number that eventually shows up on a receipt at a gas station on a completely different continent. Consider how fast that repricing actually happens. An insurance underwriter doesn't wait for a formal government confirmation before adjusting a premium on a tanker scheduled to transit the strait that week. They're watching the same open source shipping trackers, the same UKMTO alerts, the same social media reports of patrol boat movements that analysts and journalists are watching. The moment word gets out that a vessel's been struck near the Straits' southern approaches or Keshem Island, premiums move within hours, sometimes faster than official government statements even go out. That's the part of this war that never makes it into a strike count headline, a market reacting to raw, unverified, real-time information faster than either government can shape the narrative around it. And I think it's worth pausing on the human side of just those first few incidents because it's easy for the sheer scale of the broader numbers, 300 targets, 800 vessels, 1,000 patrol boats, to flatten out what actually happened to real people that week. A crew member from the GFS Galaxy went missing. An entire crew from another damaged container vessel had to abandon their ship altogether near the Iranian coast, out in open water, in the middle of an active war zone. Those are merchant sailors doing an ordinary job, moving cargo through a waterway that's suddenly become one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean on the planet. And none of the broader strategic analysis changes what that week was actually like for the people physically on board those vessels when the missiles came in. It's worth remembering, too, that merchant crews on vessels like these are rarely from the country whose flag the ship flies. A Cyprus-flagged container ship, a Marshall Islands-flagged tanker, a Liberian-flagged tanker. These flags are almost always matters of maritime registration and taxation, not nationality. The actual sailors on board come from all over the world, often from countries with no direct stake in this war at all, working ordinary shipping contracts that happen to route them through the single most contested waterway on the planet during exactly the week it got most dangerous. That's a detail that rarely makes it into the strike count coverage, but it's an important part of understanding who actually absorbs the risk when a war like this one spills over into commercial shipping lanes. So where does this actually leave things? On one side, you've got Iran publicly declaring the strait closed and promising continued attacks until American involvement in the region ends entirely. On the other side, you've got CENTCOM publicly insisting the strait was never actually closed, backed by a specific, citable number of vessels and barrels that moved through it anyway. Both of those claims were being made loudly, publicly, and simultaneously, during the exact same week that more than 300 military targets were getting struck. That's not a war that's heading toward a clean, mutually acknowledged outcome. That's two sides each, building their own version of events for their own audiences, while the actual shooting continues underneath both narratives. I think that tension is the real story here, more than any single strike number. A war doesn't need both sides to agree on what happened for it to keep escalating. It just needs both sides to keep acting on their own version of events. And based on everything confirmed from that week in July, that's exactly what was happening. Iran attacking ships it considered to be violating its own rules for the strait, and the United States responding each time with a bigger strike package than the last, while both governments told two completely different stories about who actually controlled that stretch of water. There's a longer pattern worth naming here too, because this exact dynamic, competing public claims running in parallel with an active military campaign, has repeated itself throughout this entire war, not just during this 1 week. Iranian state media has consistently downplayed or reframed damage after nearly every major strike since the war began back in February, from the aftermath of Operation Epic Fury through the underground missile facility, strikes near cities like Bandar Abbas and further inland, all the way through this specific week in July. CENTCOM has consistently countered with specific, citable figures, target counts, vessel counts, barrel counts, numbers precise enough to sound authoritative, even when they can't always be independently verified in real time. Neither side's numbers are necessarily wrong. They're just answering different questions, aimed at different audiences, and neither one is designed to give you the full picture on its own. Before I wrap this one up, I want to go back to where we started, because I think it's the most important number in this entire story. One attack on one ship on a Monday in July turned into more than 300 military targets struck by the following weekend. That's the actual mechanism of escalation in this war, laid out in a single week's timeline. It doesn't take a dramatic, singular turning point to blow a conflict wide open. Sometimes it just takes one tanker, one missile, and a government on the other side that's already decided the ceasefire is over. It's worth thinking about what that mechanism actually predicts for whatever comes next, rather than just describing what already happened. If the pattern holds, escalation doesn't require a new, larger provocation each time. It just requires Iran continuing to enforce its own version of the rules for who can transit the strait, and the United States continuing to answer each enforcement action with a strike package larger than the one before it. That's not a stable equilibrium. Curves that keep climbing every single round eventually either force one side to genuinely back down, or they keep climbing until the target list stops looking like a maritime strike network and starts looking like something considerably broader. Nothing in the reporting from that week tells us which of those two outcomes is more likely. It just tells us very clearly which direction the trend line was pointing. So where do you think this goes from here? Do you think Iran's patrol boat fleet and its maritime strike network can keep absorbing losses at this rate without a real change in strategy? Or do you think this specific pattern, ship gets hit, US answers with a bigger strike package, Iran promises more attacks anyway, just keeps repeating itself until something on one side finally breaks? I'd genuinely like to hear which way you think this leans. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. I built this out from CENTCOM's own public statements and social media posts from that week, from reporting on the specific vessels struck, the Rekayyat, the Wedyan, the Cyprus Prosperity, and the GFS Galaxy, and from tracking on Iran's patrol boat activity in and around the strait during that same period. It's a lot of moving pieces packed into 5 days, and I wanted to actually walk through the sequence properly instead of just reacting to whichever single strike made the most dramatic headline. We'll keep tracking this one as it develops, because if the pattern from that week holds, it almost certainly won't be the last time a single ship attack in the Strait of Hormuz turns into a multi-day campaign against hundreds of targets.